In today's society, the characteristics of vampires are well established. They're blood-sucking monsters who are blind to reflections and have teeth. Garlic is effective as a repellent, and a spike to the heart is effective in killing them. Some of them, like Dracula, are the wealthy elite who own castles. Vampires, on the other hand, didn't always have such strict definitions. Scholars believe that modern ideas about Halloween creatures are derived from a wide range of European folk beliefs. It was widely held among believers of these religions that the departed, even after death and burial, posed a threat to the living. It's widely known that misconceptions about decomposition are at the root of many urban legends. The skin of a dead body might shrink to the point where the teeth and fingernails appear to have lengthened. A dark purge fluid can also leak out of the lips and nostrils as internal organs fail. Novice viewers can mistake the liquid for blood and conclude that the dead person drank it from a living person. Those gruesomely murdered bodies weren't the only ones that raised eyebrows. People used to blame vampires for the slow destruction of their villages before they learned the true nature of the diseases that plagued them. Mark Collins Jenkins says in his book Vampire Forensics that throughout the history of vampire lore, sickness has remained as inseparable companion of the undead. People wanted to feel as though they had some control over sickness, so they would try to kill vampires or stop them from feeding. This would give them a sense of satisfaction. Where do vampires come from? It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when the concept of a vampire was first conceived because practically every culture has its own variation on the vampire myth. But in order to discover where the urban mythology of vampires comes from, you have to travel all the way back to Romania in the 15th century and meet Vlad Dracula, as referred to as Vlad the Impaler. Although Vlad the Impaler was a murderer, he was not a vampire. However, Bram Stoker was inspired by Vlad to name his now famous vampire character Count Dracula in his book Dracula, which was published in 1897. Numerous vampire scares have occurred over the course of human history. These vampire scares are frequently connected to epidemics of disease, such as the European plague, or to the misinterpretation of unusual physical characteristics. Eric Nussum suggests in his book, The Dead Travel Fast, Stalking Vampires from Nosferatu to Count Chocula, that people's belief in vampires helped them to find things that they didn't comprehend and couldn't explain, specifically death and sickness. Vampires of Europe. As a consequence of this, fears of vampires frequently occurred at the same time as epidemics of the plague. In 2006, a team of archaeologists in Venice, Italy, discovered a skull that dated back to the 16th century and had been buried with plague victims with a brick placed in its mouth. It is likely that the brick was used as a burial practice to stop strega, which are Italian vampires or witches, from emerging from the grave and feasting on the living. It was believed that not all vampires would actually emerge from their graves. Nachzehrer, also known as after-devourers, were people who stayed buried in the ground in northern Germany and chewed on their burial shrouds. Again, it is likely that the purge fluid is to blame for this notion. The purge fluid might cause the shroud to sag or tear, giving the appearance that a corpse has been gnawing on it. It was believed that these stationary masticators caused difficulties above ground, and that they were also considered to be the most effective during epidemics of the plague. A Protestant theologian wrote the treatise On the Chewing Dead in 1679, in which he accused the Nachzehrer of using occult practices to cause harm to the members of their family who had survived. He said that humans could stop them by exhuming the body and cramming its mouth with soil, along with possibly a stone and a coin for good measure. This would prevent the zombies from rising again. According to the tract, the corpse would perish from starvation if it did not possess the ability to chew. To the displeasure of certain political and religious authorities, stories about vampires persisted and thrived in the nations of southern and eastern Europe throughout the 17th and 18th century. By the middle of the 18th century, Pope Benedict XIV had declared that vampires were fallacious fictions of human fantasy, and the Habsburg monarch Maria Theresa had condemned ideas about vampires as being superstition and fraud. Still, anti-vampire activities continued. 2 centuries after the notorious witch trials in Salem, one of the last major fears about vampires emerged in New England in the 19th century. This event took place in the same region as the Salem witch trials. Mercy Brown, who was 19 years old when she passed away in 1892, had tuberculosis, which was more commonly referred to as consumption back then. Her mother and sister had passed away, and her brother Edwin was struggling with his illness. Neighbors who cared about Edwin were concerned that one of the recently deceased Brown women may have tried to harm him after she passed away. When they opened the grave of Mercy Brown, they discovered blood in both her mouth and her heart. They regarded this as an indication that she was a vampire, even though at the time they didn't use that term. As a usual anti-vampire strategy, the neighbors torched Mercy's heart and combined the ashes with other ingredients to create a mixture for Edwin to drink. However, he could not recover from his illness and passed away a few months after taking the potion. This wasn't a one-off thing that happened. Michael Bell, a folklorist and author of the book Food for the Dead, estimates that there are 60 known examples of anti-vampire rituals that were used in New England during the 18th and 19th century, in addition to numerous others that were practiced in other parts of the country. According to Brian Carroll, a history professor at Central Washington University who is now preparing a book on the topic, these rites were most frequently in eastern Connecticut and western Rhode Island. He says this in the introduction to his book. Carroll thinks that German doctors who worked for the Hessian soldiers were the ones who introduced this as a medical treatment in the period of the American Revolution. Because of this, he believes that the vampires from New England were modeled after Nekrasa from Germany. According to him, the vampires that lived in New England did not drink blood like their colleagues in Romania, but instead remained in their graves and used sympathetic magic to cause harm to the living from a distance. Bell, on the other hand, is of the opinion that anti-vampire actions in New England originated from a number of different areas and that the presumed vampires of New England were in fact more similar to Romanian vampires than to Nekrasa vampires. According to him, New Englanders, much like Romanians, were seeking for liquid blood in the important organs, not signs of shroud chewing. Contrary to Romanians, the New Englanders did not find indications of shroud chewing. In Romania, anti-vampire cure that involved cutting off the heart, burning it to ashes, and delivering the ashes to the ill person or sick person was also used. Are vampires real? During the Middle Ages, beliefs in vampires flourished, which is not surprising given the widespread damage inflicted by the epidemic. Lesions in the mouth that bled frequently were common complications of the sickness, and to the ignorant, this was a clear indication that the sufferers had been bitten by vampires. It was not uncommon for medical professionals to diagnose a person as a vampire if they had never seen them before and they suffered from a strange physical or emotional disease. Many scientists believe that porphyria, a blood ailment that causes painful blisters on sun-exposed skin, lies at the root of the vampire myth. Some people with porphyria report feeling better after consuming blood. Rabies and goiter have also been held responsible for spreading the vampire belief. It was common practice to dig up the remains of a deceased person who had been the subject of vampire rumors in order to look for obvious signs of the undead. In certain instances, the person's heart was pierced with a spike to ensure that they remained dead after they were buried. According to other sources, the practice of beheading and burning the corpses of those thought to be vampires continued well into the 19th century. The modern-time vampires. Vampire myths have been debunked by science, but there are still those who claim to be vampires. They look like any other human, but they drink tiny amounts of blood in an attempt to maintain their health. Most modern vampires prefer to keep to themselves, and their feeding rituals, which typically involve drinking the blood of willing donors, are typically conducted in private to avoid reigniting vampire superstitions. Such communities can be found on the internet and in cities and towns around the world. People suddenly got interested in vampires after Dracula was published. Numerous movies, books, and TV shows have since been inspired by the legend of Count Dracula. And that concludes Just Gotta Watch's The Real Truth About Vampires. Thanks for watching.